Good evening, everybody. My name is Jo, and welcome to this Transport Planning Society event. My name is Joanna Ward, and I'm delighted that you've joined us this evening. Through a mix of presentations and round-the-table questions, we're going to explore an important topic, a transport system that is accessible for everyone. For the past 3 years, it's been my pleasure to be the Transport Planning Society board member responsible for organising the annual bursary competition for young professionals. The bursary scheme encourages young professionals working in the transport profession to produce a piece of structured thought on a current topic relevant to transport planning. Each year, our finalists are supported by a senior member of the profession and are tasked with producing a 5,000-word written piece and presenting this to a panel of judges made up of members of the Transport Planning Society board. In 2020, we chose to make the topic a transport system that's accessible for everyone. How do we make that happen? The 2020 competition was our most successful to date in terms of number of entries, further cementing the work that needs to be done and led by us as professionals working in the field to ensure that transport systems are accessible and fair for everybody. No one was more delighted than me to see that this topic has been fully embraced by the Society and forms the theme for this year's Transport Planning Day. So for this evening's event, this evening's event is part of the programme leading up to Transport Planning Day on the 15th of November this year. And I'm delighted that we're joined this evening by a number of our finalists from the Transport Planning Society Bursary Competition for 2020. The evening's going to follow the following format. We'll hear for about 10 minutes from each of our finalists on the research piece that they undertook for the competition. And then we're going to take some questions from the audience. So if you've got a question and you'd like to put that in the chat, I'll keep an eye on that during the evening. And we'll have a bit of a roundtable discussion at the end. We'll aim to wrap everything up before 8 o'clock. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome our first finalist. And Rachel, I believe you're going to present to us first. So if you'd like to introduce yourself and just tell us where you are and what your job is, and then we'll get started.
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Rachel. I am currently in Hull, but I work in Leeds. So COVID's been quite good for my commuting. And my job's a graduate transport planner at Jacobs.
Brilliant, Rachel. We're really looking forward to hearing your presentation. So if I can ask all the other finalists to turn their cameras off and we'll listen to Rachel's presentation.
So my research topic was whether a more accessible public transport system could be a byproduct of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I focused on Leeds. Ooh. Having some technical difficulties. There we go. Okay, so a bit of an overview of my presentation. I'm going to start by going through the context of my research and then the different stages of research that I undertook and my findings and recommendations. So the spread of COVID-19 has prompted behavioural changes in all aspects of society. It's currently a major challenge that society is facing. And 2020 and now 2021 has seen an unprecedented change in travel behaviour and provision as a result of the pandemic, and this has definitely been seen in commuting. So WICA found that 63% of respondents would be more likely to work from home in the long term than they were before lockdown, and you can see that there's been a similar trend shown in this graph here. So this shows some travel to work data from the ONS. And from March in 2020, there was a massive reduction in the amount of people using cars, rail and bus to travel to work. While cars has recovered somewhat, bus and rail has definitely not recovered quite as well. So the aim of this paper is to discover whether it's possible that the pandemic may have widened opportunities for people with a disability through changes to how people use the public transport system. As a result of these behavioural changes that we can see here, and as well as through increased acceptance of different behavioural patterns. And I wanted to provide a local context to this by studying Leeds. So a quick overview of the research I undertook. So I started with some desktop research with my literature review and policy review, and so I'm just going to go through those findings now. From the literature, physical barriers to public transport were raised, including infrastructure, the surrounding environment and signage, as well as social barriers, so the need to pre-book assistance and fear caused by previous bad experiences were the main reasons that public transport was considered to be less accessible. So potential solutions to this included to improve the infrastructure, to increase training provision, to make the services better for people with disabilities, and to improve the reliability of services and communication of these services. Or the other option would be to telecommute or work from home. So as I'm sure some of you might be aware by now, advantages to working from home include no travel, control over the working environment, more frequent rests, improved morale and productivity. But disadvantages include social isolation and the fact it doesn't help attitudes by just keeping everyone at home rather than making the workplace more accessible. Or the journey to the workplace more accessible, sorry. And then in terms of policy, so WICA are responsible for the transport network in Leeds, and current initiatives that they have in place include infrastructure. So many bus routes offer low floor, easy access buses, and buses have space for a wheelchair user and priority seating. They also have concessionary fares in place. So examples of this include the M card and the disabled person's rail card. So 45,000 people with disabilities benefit from free off-peak bus travel and half fare off-peak train travel, which is great. WICA have also focused on information, so travel planning apps such as Move It are really useful to provide audible options, which is great for people with disabilities, to receive real-time journey information. And assistant travel services, so these are available on trains, but a bit of a downside to that is that you've got to book within 24 hours in advance. In relation to the pandemic, so recent changes include reduced seating on services, timetable changes and improved information. So bus operators in particular have been providing more information on their websites and on apps, which allow passengers to check how busy the bus is before boarding. And this information is also provided on the front of the bus, which is good. And then also additional cleaning. So in terms of my primary research, I conducted an online survey which was active for about 5 weeks, and so 8 telephone interviews in total, along with a focus group discussion from stakeholders in Leeds. So a bit of background information of the people that took part in the survey. 65% of respondents reported that they use the train, and 56% of people use the bus, and 81% of respondents answered that they do not consider themselves to have a disability. So this could be a bit of a downside to my sample size of people that responded to the survey. But from that, I discovered that the following reasons why public transport in Leeds particular makes it accessible. So physical infrastructure at train stations, including ramps, lifts, accessible toilet facilities, and physical infrastructure on buses, so wheelchair spaces and audio stop announcements were considered to be really positive. It was also mentioned that bus drivers help passengers board if necessary, and there's a provision of bus passes for people with disabilities, as well as assistance services at train stations. However, some reasons why the public transport is inaccessible in Leeds include limited step-free access to platforms at local train stations such as Garforth. Buses and trains are overcrowded at peak times, meaning people with disabilities may struggle to get to disability designated areas. It was also noted that there are some attitude problems with people blocking empty seats or taking up priority seating, or just generally showing hostility for slow movers, maybe because they're unaware of the reason why. Infrequent or late bus services and poor communication about this. Audio announcements on buses are inconsistently provided. So the audio announcements, while positive, if they're not always turned on, then they can't be relied upon, which is quite a negative. Clearer signage needed to educate people about people with hidden disabilities and connectivity between modes. So it's not just about the bus journey or train journey itself, it's about getting to the stops and then when you get off as well. So in relation to the pandemic, the responses were mixed about the impact on public transport, with 87% of respondents suggesting that the pandemic has reduced crowding and that public transport has become more hygienic, but the services offered have also become less frequent, according to 42% of respondents. And it was suggested that there's a bit of a fear to use public transport, which again is not a great thing. And then in terms of whether the pandemic's made public transport more accessible, 48% stated that they were unsure, which kind of reflects this mixed bag of responses. In relation to working from home, 93% of respondents have worked from home, with 67% starting to work from home since the pandemic. And some advantages to that line up with the literature, so no travel and flexible hours, greater control over the working environment. But negatives then include the reduced interaction with others, so mental health implications and potentially longer working hours. So then to supplement this, I also conducted telephone interviews, and 3 themes arose from the telephone interviews, which were connectivity, information and flexibility. So the first theme of connectivity, physical infrastructure needs to be improved between modes, which relates to that journey from your home to work, not just the transport itself, which generally relate to like improving signage and crossing facilities. But then also telecommuting is not a complete solution. So people were missing that connectivity with people. So you can't just replace a potentially in like a less accessible transport system by just saying everyone can work from home if they want to, because there are obviously downsides to working from home. The second theme that arose was information. So information provision for people with disabilities has been improved as a result of the pandemic, but more progress is definitely needed. So a big positive has been the real-time journey information that has been provided. So the improved information through apps and audible announcements. But there are definitely some improvements that can be made to these, such as keeping your audio announcements turned on. The other thing that was brought up in relation to information was that a greater understanding about hidden disabilities is needed amongst the general public. So one bad experience is considered to be very off-putting, and there's a great need for people to be kind to people with like visibility disabilities, for example, may struggle to be socially distanced, and people just need to be a bit aware of this. So there's some education needed there. And then the third theme that arose from the telephone interviews was the flexibility. So flexibility of working hours can help reduce crowding on public transport, making it more accessible for people with disabilities. And it also makes it easier for people to attend appointments and information sessions, or they can choose to travel at quieter times, which can help avoid some of the anxiety caused by overcrowding. But it's important that the frequency of services doesn't reduce with reduced demand, because then these benefits would not be materialised. Flexibility over the work environment can also be helpful, but it's not a complete solution. So it's more likely that the individual will have a work environment suited to them if they work from home, but it's important to realise that not everybody will have the right equipment to work from home, and so this should not be a solution that's relied upon. So in terms of the recommendations that came out from my research, for policymakers, subsidies for operators, because operators need an incentive to keep the same frequency of services despite the reduction in demand. It's also important that the public are educated about people with hidden disabilities. So one bad experience can be very off-putting, and people need to be aware of this, and so education can play a part of that. And infrastructure, so physical infrastructure improvements are needed, particularly to connect modes. Tactile braille signage, audio signage at bus stops, for example, could be a way to do this, or pelican crossings between nearby stops and stations to help make that journey a little bit easier. And then for employers, so flexible hours, people benefit from managing time more flexibly, and this can help reduce demand for transport at peak times. Then operators, information provision has been really valuable during the pandemic. So these improvements to real-time information are really positive and should be continued, but further developments could be made to provide greater information. So although they're providing information about whether there's space on the bus, providing information about whether there's a wheelchair space or priority seating on the bus would be a really good improvement on the front of buses to help people plan their journeys. And audio announcements should be turned on because they're really valued. So in summary, the recommendations focus on the need for employers to remain flexible about working hours, operators to continue providing more information about capacity, and for resources to be targeted at increasing awareness amongst the public about hidden disabilities. And then it was also found that there are some improvements needed relating to infrastructure, but this is not really related to the pandemic, so more research should probably be conducted to investigate this in more detail. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Rachel. We really appreciate you presenting your research this evening. And I just want to thank everybody at this point who's come to this event this evening. In coming to this event today, you are supporting young professionals working in the profession. So I don't think that any of the people we've got on the call tonight claim to be experts in this area, but they've all been researching this as an additional thing to the job that they do every day. And I think it's phenomenal to see the amount of research that you've done and that you're keeping this conversation and an action plan that we need to act on going. So I just want to thank you for that at this point, and thank everybody who's here supporting young members of the profession. Thank you, Rachel. We'll look forward to talking to you as part of the roundtable questions in a bit. I know you've sparked some interest in the chat already, so I'll speak to you in a bit. And we're moving on now. We're going to hear from Ruth. So Ruth, if you'd like to put your camera on and introduce yourself and tell us where you are, we're looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Yes, so hello everybody. My name is Ruth Cargom, and I work for Jacobs as a graduate transport planner in Glasgow. So
welcome, Ruth. We're looking forward to hearing your presentation. It's all yours.
Cheers, thank you. Hopefully everyone can see it. Cool. So my research that I'm presenting today is going to be focused on the role of autonomous pods and how and if they could have a role within making our transport more accessible for all. So just to start off, I'll give you a quick outline of what I'm going to run through today. Firstly, a brief outline of the scope and the rationale of my study. Then move on to the methodology used. And then I'll talk about a discussion on the basics of autonomous pods that are currently being developed and trialled. And then we'll be looking at disadvantaged groups within our current transport network and explore if autonomous pods could eliminate any of the barriers. And then finally, onto a quick summary. So a transport system that is accessible for everyone, how do we make this happen? So when I first got this scope, so the first question that came to my mind was, who are the most isolated and disadvantaged groups within our current transport network, and how are their needs being provided in our future transport strategies? The future of urban environments and our cities are being pictured as cleaner and greener, and where access by private vehicle will be far more restrictive, and this is obviously to aim to improve air quality, health, living conditions for those that live in these urban environments. However, whilst these policies are hugely beneficial for many reasons, they introduce increased restrictions and also perceived restrictions for those who rely on a private vehicle to meet their daily needs. Autonomous vehicles are gaining more traction as a viable transport mode with increased safety and potential to reduce traffic congestion being among one of the key benefits. However, as cities are turning away from private vehicle use, the autonomy sector is also shifting to optimising our public transport services from bus platoons to autonomous pods. Their aim in this is to reduce travel costs, improve reliability, expand services that we're providing. However, a little research has been carried out on investigating the potential benefits and impacts of autonomous transport and reducing barriers for those most disadvantaged within our current networks. This study will look at the barriers people currently face whilst navigating public transport and explore the impact of autonomous pods and how that could improve their accessibility. So first of all, methodology. So I began my research with some secondary investigative research into, firstly, autonomous pods and their capabilities, and secondly, into the most key barriers that people face on public transport across the UK. And then I explore which sort of groups are most affected by these barriers. I then had some discussions with industry leads from within the future transport technology sort of sector, that's with public sector academics and those that work with autonomous pods. And this was to gain a sort of understanding of the capabilities and the sort of future of autonomous networks. And finally, after I identified the most disadvantaged groups within our public transport system, I contacted and interviewed a number of focus groups from people from these sort of disadvantaged areas or those that represented them. These interviews focused on what impact autonomous pods could have on their accessibility to amenities and just general opportunities. So autonomous pods. So autonomous pods are a form of urban transport that's been developed and trialled across the UK, urban environments, and across the world, really. So to establish my sort of understanding of autonomous pods, I honed in on 3 major players in the market. These were Arugo, UK Autodrive, and Westfield AVs. I found that all 3 of these companies had very similar aims, and resulting in, the aim was to create an autonomous hire transport that can be seamlessly adapted to multiple environments. With having a similar aim, I found that they had very similar overarching characteristics. So obviously included them being driverless. They generally had accessibility features for wheelchair users, also blind and deaf technology. These pods would be made available 24/7, working on a sort of on-demand service, obviously not needing sort of permanent staff. And they're a far more adaptable route choice, and therefore they're not restricted to designated routes like buses, and they can travel on both roads and pedestrianised areas. And clearly they're generally used for sort of last mile or first mile journeys, very short to medium lengths. So although the pods are driverless vehicles and they could potentially provide a seamless transport mode as they're unrestricted to routes and timetables, there are still many valid concerns about their future. In many of my discussions, it was made extremely clear that the UK urban environments and cities lack general preparedness with technology and smart cities to even imagine adopting this sort of technology and infrastructure today. Additionally, there are key concerns raised about adopting autonomous pods that may direct people away from active modes of transport or travel, which obviously we're very in our cities today, we're very keen to promote. So on to currently our sort of most disadvantaged groups. I found that most people who are disadvantaged within our public transport network are those that require extra assistance, or those who perhaps do not conform to the norm, or at least the pre-COVID norm, which was the 9 to 5 sort of working pattern commute, where public transport is currently sort of designed around. Interviews that I focused on were particularly with the groups from the elderly, physically and mentally disabled, shift or part-time workers, and caregivers. And I interviewed people within these groups and those who represented them, including some charities. And they were all held virtually. So to my responses. So first, I asked what their key barriers were on a day-to-day basis on their public transport. Some key themes were really identified by the users, which covered from mobility limitations, lack of support and frequency, restricted route choice, and affordability. So with mobility, it was a key barrier for those disabled in the elderly groups. They found that mobility issues occur at all stages of the journey, from travelling to and from public transport, getting on and off, and travelling on the public transport. Additionally, some found that a lack of support and staff in certain stations leads to uncertainty about use of service, and where staff are present, many felt that the disability was not really understood. Infrequency and lack of routes was another particular barrier. Sort of out with peak times generally is a particular barrier for shift and part-time and unemployed people. For many, they highlighted that the local transport network are lacking, and often the transport is focused around the city, where perhaps their sort of job market that is relevant to their skills is focused elsewhere, where there's no accessibility to them. Others found that a lack of transport limits amenity choice to the immediate local area, which meant that their amenities were perhaps more expensive than if they had a bigger range. Okay, and then finally, affordability was one of the key barriers to accessing transport. Highlighted many of the shift workers have spent a large sum of their monthly income on transport. They did highlight where cheaper options were available with a monthly or annual pass. When it came to the point of needing to buy these, often they could not afford the lump sum needed and purchase these passes. And those who are unemployed and on 0 hour contracts were often unsure about, reluctant to buy these passes due to sort of uncertainty in work. So onto the autonomous pods. So after discussing the barriers, I went on to give them a brief outline on autonomous pods and discussed with the focus groups how we think this could impact their lives both positively and negatively. Here are some of the key themes that were identified. Largely, the concept on autonomous pods were well received across the groups. Many potential benefits were highlighted. The most significant benefit identified was the flexibility of not being restricted by routes and timetables, which is particularly identified by those unemployed and shift workers, who said this would alleviate issues with peak hours and increase the amount of employment and other opportunities they have access to. For the elderly and disabled, it was identified that the door-to-door service pods would aid in navigating their local areas, as they would be able to avoid areas where they would find it difficult to walk due to poorly maintained footways, allowing them to visit family and friends who live out with their local areas and perhaps do this more independently. Additionally, it would alleviate any stresses of moving within shared spaces for the blind and deaf communities. However, some barriers were identified by the groups and that would perhaps put them off using the service. A key concern was the reduced social contact that would occur with using these services. The elderly and mental health groups highlighted that for many, using public transport actually allows them to have increased social interactions, and for some, this could be their only social contact on a day-to-day basis. And removing this by using autonomous pods, this could lead to a more isolated elderly population and perhaps hinder the health progresses of those suffering from mental health conditions. Another concern was unpredictable waiting times. Some elderly residents highlighted that they often refrain from using dial bus services when there's sometimes needs a lot of pre-planning is needed and often unavailable for a last-minute trip. If these services had long waiting times, this could also be an off-put. This also concerns shift workers and the unemployed who need to arrive at their shift or interview on time, or perhaps onto the next mode of transport, perhaps like a train. And then lastly, the sort of concern of cost was highlighted. However, at the sort of early stage of trials and development, cost of these services is pretty unknown and uncertain. Although some studies have sort of highlighted that due to their sort of method of running, as they would not require as many staff run off electricity, that perhaps their sort of ongoing costs would be a lot less than our current network, and that so perhaps in the long term it might be a more affordable option for the user. So just to summarise, so I think it's clear that there's no quick fix or one solution for all to create a transport system that's acceptable for everybody. But this study has shown that autonomous pods could go some way into widening access, opportunities, employment through less restrictive routes and timetables, whilst ensuring that the elderly and disabled are able to navigate our future urban environments as they're becoming cleaner and greener spaces with less private vehicle use. I think the reduced social contact is a key concern, especially as other aspects of our lives are increasingly becoming digital, and therefore any social interaction will be vital to improving mental health of all population and reducing isolation. Although you could also argue that through the use of these services, people might be able to go out and reach more amenities by using it, so therefore increasing their interactions and accessing more amenities and opportunities. However, the potential impact of this would need to be explored much further. It is likely to challenge the developers of these autonomous pods, as their ethos of autonomous pods is to provide an independent, private mode of travel. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ruth. That's really, really interesting. Thanks for your presentation. I really appreciate it. I think it's really interesting to see, and I'm sure people who've joined the chat this evening will be really interested to see the different directions that everybody's taken in terms of looking at the one topic that we set. So each year when we set the topic for the Transport Planning Society Bursary competition, we set a wide topic. And as I've said, last year's was an accessible transport system for everybody. How do we make that happen? And it's interesting to see how you've all gone off in literally completely different directions with your research and the things that you've found out. So thank you for that. It was really, really interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you. As I said before, if you've got any questions, please put them in the chat. But I just want to and we can make sure we put those to people at the end of the conversation. So keep putting those in there. And just to reiterate to you all that these are young professionals who've done this research extra to their day-to-day work. And it's really interesting to see where they've taken all of that. Next on the agenda tonight, we've got Lauren James. So Lauren, do you want to put your camera on and introduce yourself? Oh, I hope Lauren's there. Hi, Lauren.
Hi there. Hi, I'm Lauren. I am a senior health pursuits officer working at Sustrans, and we're working to increase walking and cycling within London.
Brilliant. We're really looking forward to your presentation. It's all yours.
Perfect. I will just try to share this screen. Always proves slightly difficult. There we go. Can you all see that?
We can see your screen, Lauren.
Perfect. I will make a start. So thank you very much to Transport Planning Society for the opportunity, not only for the bursary competition, but to present here. It was a really great experience, and I really would recommend it to others for future years. My research was looking at inclusivity of cycling within a COVID context in London. So through my work at Sustrans, I'd noticed disparities within cycling pre-pandemic, and with cycling massively increasing during the pandemic, I was interested in if this would be inclusive for all, or if COVID had actually widened these disparities. Just a slight disclaimer here, of course, disability is a very complex issue, this is just a dip in the ocean, but hopefully it gets the conversation flowing about this really important topic. So firstly, just an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. So this research was conducted last autumn in 2020, so I'll just give a bit of context behind COVID in London in 2020. I'll then run through the methodology and my key findings and recommendations. And I thought it could be quite interesting to see where we are now a year on from when this research was done, and see what more might need to be done. So London 2020 in the COVID context. So for me, I think it's a really good summary to London in 2020 in the transport sector. So you've got figure 1, which shows an increase in cycle uptake from pre-pandemic in 2019 to 2020, and figure 2, which shows Space to Mutual by Sustrans, which shows the emergency infrastructure implemented to increase walking cycling in London. So on the surface, this is all a really great step forward for the cycling world. A quick bit of methodology for my research. So first of all, I looked at a policy review for the gear change and the LTM 120 guidance documents that were released in England in 2020. I then moved on to data collection. So I looked at, I did some online surveys. These had to be done online because the research was conducted in our November lockdown. So I then paired these with in-depth interviews, and they really helped delve a bit deeper into the challenges faced by many individuals. I then reviewed some of the emergency infrastructure that was implemented in London. So on a very rainy day in November, I completed an EQIA on an LTM while on a tricycle with an all-ability-led ride with Bikeworks. That was so useful to highlight the barriers for wider cycles in particular. And I then used that insight from what I learned here from my own experience on the tricycle, but also from the other individuals on the ride, to conduct 3 more EQIAs on emergency cycle lanes, again, from the perspective of a wider cycle. So just a brief summary of the policy review of the gear change and LTN 120 documents. I think it's really important to say that this is a huge step forward for many disability campaigning groups. The top of the slide highlights some of the barriers that many disabled individuals face for cycling, and I think it goes a long way to target some of these. For the first time, infrastructure is an underlying theme, and there are many structure changes specific for adapted cycles, with imagery and phrasing around adapted cycles as well, which is the first kind of time that this has been done. which is really great. However, there are some areas that are missing from the policy and potentially don't go far enough to create the truly inclusive cycle uptake that we'd like. I've split these into 3 main areas. So the first being that this is simply a guidance document rather than a minimum standard, and it raises questions of how we're going to get people, transport practitioners, to go for the aspiration to accommodate wider cycles in design rather than stick with the minimum that might not be truly inclusive. Secondly, this is very infrastructure focused, and studies have shown that infrastructure alone cannot achieve truly inclusive cycle uptake. And finally, there are a few examples in the guidance that actually went against suggestions that had been previously suggested by disability campaigning groups for inclusive cycle uptake. So an example of this is Wheels for Wellbeing, identifying that cycles can be used as mobility aids and therefore campaign for shared use paths, whereas this guidance suggests that cyclists should be treated like cars rather than pedestrians. So just moving on to the findings for low traffic neighbourhoods in this research. So the research found overall support for LTNs and increasing the confidence in perception and safety for cyclists surveyed. For certain types of cycles, for example, wider cycles or 3 or more wheeled cycles, there was overall support for LTNs due to reduced traffic on the road. So the first reason for this is road camber. So there often is steeper gradient towards the edge of the road, which leaves cycles such as tricycles unbalanced. So by being able to position in the middle of the road with traffic-free roads, this enables them to be more balanced. Also, the lower level of some adaptive cycles, so again, such as tricycles or recumbent cycles, means that their visibility from cars is reduced. And again, positioning in the middle of the road of traffic-free roads at junctions is much safer for them to turn. However, there were problems highlighted with low traffic neighbourhoods. So Wheels for Wellbeing suggests that a minimum of 2 metres between barriers should be maintained if barriers must be implemented at all. On my lead ride during my EQIA in Newham in London, and the left image showed that this has been maintained and we were able to cycle through on the wider cycles. However, on the image on the right, this shows that this hasn't been maintained, and we were this was a barrier for us accessing the LTN. Moving on to the key findings for emergency cycle lanes. So the research found that segregated cycle lanes would increase perceived level of safety. However, infrastructure in place was identified as being inadequate for a wide range of wider cycles. The EQIAs conducted on the 3 emergency cycle lanes identified 3 main problems. So the first one being width and segregation. So only one of the cycle lanes that I looked at had the 3 metre desirable width for an adapted cycle. And the physical segregation by chicane barriers of the cycle lanes acted as an actual physical barrier for the access of wider cycles when the cycle lane was already not wide enough. A second problem was that only one of the emergency cycle lanes was continuous to the wider cycle network. And this was essentially a problem because rejoining the carriageway was identified as a main barrier to cycling for some of the surveyed respondents. And thirdly, many respondents suggested that they've never actually seen any emergency cycle lanes in their area. And this was also identified on the lead ride with bike works as well. So moving on to the key findings for behaviour change interventions. So behaviour change interventions were overwhelmingly identified as really important to aid inclusive cycle uptake going forward. And this was largely left out of gear change policy released in early last year. There are 4 main interventions highlighted specifically in this research. So the first one being a COVID-specific example that parks such as the park in East London were restricted to cyclists or closed during the first lockdown, and this proved a barrier to cycling for potentially less confident cyclists. Secondly, current dockless rental cycles schemes in London are not inclusive of adapted cycles, and there's a lack of inclusive cycle loan schemes across London. Thirdly, specific cycle training for adapted cycles was suggested as an intervention, and I do not currently know of any that actually include this. So as suggested earlier, lower level tricycles may require specific training to increase the safety, for example, at junctions. And a fourth suggestion was for knowledge hubs to share information around adapted cycles, as currently this is quite hard to access. Finally, inclusive hubs was suggested as a standalone suggestion in the research for increasing cycle uptake for many of the surveyed respondents. And they also were suggested to have the ability to host and deliver the 4 behaviour change interventions that were also identified. So just moving on to having a look at my recommendations that I set out last year and where we are currently at. In general, cycle uptake is still higher than pre-pandemic levels, and however, this rate has slowed down compared to the start of the pandemic. There has been research conducted into the equity of cycling, for example, by Transport for All and LTNs. However, I think that this needs to be reviewed. As suggested, disability is a complex issue, and there is no kind of overriding way that we can go to solve this. So this needs to take individual disabilities and their needs. So moving on to the first recommendation that I suggested. So the main finding, of course, was that behaviour change interventions must go hand in hand with infrastructure interventions. Although this wasn't included in the gear change guidance, there has been some progress here. So capability funding has recently been released in July 2020, and this is a specific funding for behaviour change initiatives to support emergency infrastructure implementation, such as LTNs and cycle routes, which is really great. And the research also highlighted that EQIAs are essential to be completed before infrastructure implementation. As an able-bodied individual, I think conducting the EQIA on a tricycle was really eye-opening, and I wonder if we can do some kind of similar training for local authorities going forward. As I previously mentioned, Transport for All have raised concerns about the equity of LTNs for disabled individuals. So I think that this highlights the need even more to make sure that EQIAs, possibly specifically for different types of disabilities, are conducted. The third recommendation was a need for grassroots evaluation to the monitoring of infrastructure that has been implemented. I know that TfL in London conducted their street space evaluation sessions to assess emergency infrastructure, which is great. However, this is quite a top level pan-London discussion. So I wonder if it would be useful in local authorities conducting these kind of sessions on a local level first, and then bringing this to a pan-London session to really knowledge share and make sure that problems are identified to specific locations are avoided across London. The fourth recommendation was the suggestion that EQAs are required for infrastructure implementation. Could we do the same for behaviour change interventions such as cycle training to make sure that these are truly inclusive? So I know the Bikeability Trust have recently added cycle training guidance to include a reference to special education needs children at schools. However, the parameters in reality of what this is like to deliver, so how different the delivery time may be or the number of instructors that might be needed, I think it needs to be tested. And finally, the fifth recommendation was highlighting the benefit of inclusive cycle hubs and how, despite their benefit, the provision of these in London are limited. I think that this is really important if this plays a really long-term plan going forward and not just a COVID response implementation. And finally, I thought it'd be quite nice to finish on this quote that was given to me by one of the people that I interviewed. It just shows that by making transport systems that are inclusive for more people can enjoy and use them. And I think if we're implementing new schemes, now is the time to roll them out and make sure that they're inclusive for more people. Yes, that's me.
Thanks so much, Lauren. I really appreciate that, and really interesting to hear your presentation again. For those of you that don't know very much about the bursary competition, the bursary finalists each year write their papers right up to just before Christmas in the year that they're entering the competition, and they present their findings to board members and judges in the January. So it's quite a long time since I've heard these presentations. So it's nice to be reminded of a lot of the good work that's going on, and perhaps we'll come back to that in a bit. Usually we try and do it in person. Obviously this year we did it online. So this is a new thing for all of us in terms of presenting and presenting bursary finalist entries online as well. So it's been a learning curve for all of us. I'm delighted that we have one final presenter tonight. We've got Anna with us. Anna, are you there? Hi, Anna. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us where you are today?
Sure. So my name is Anna Newey, and I work for Mott MacDonald in our Birmingham office as a senior transport planner. I'm going to try and share my screen, so I hope this works.
Right.
And you don't see all
the floor's
my notes.
yours.
Let's have a look. I think it's that one. There you go. Has that worked?
We can see your screen.
Okay, fantastic. So yeah, as I said, my name is Anna Newey and I'm a senior transport planner at Mott MacDonald. I did my piece of research on the written language and how that can or cannot create barriers to transport for those with low literacy levels. So I wanted to identify any gaps and try and figure out how we can close these gaps. Echoing what Lauren just said, I'm really thankful to the Transport Planning Society to let me do this piece of research on such an important topic, and I feel like I've just scraped the surface. And even just with this one topic of written language in our transport system, there's just so much more that I could have delved into, which I've never had that chance to do that before. So next slide. I can't get it to change. Oh, there we go. Okay, so can everyone see that? Okay, if I get rid of that, that's better, isn't it?
We can see your screen, Anna, you're fine.
Okay, fab. So this is going to be the structure of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to do a quick introduction about my topic, what I did a case study on. I also did a focus group, and then I'm going to look at the gaps which I've identified and some potential mitigations, and then some conclusions and final thoughts. So introduction. So through this piece of work, as I keep saying, I wanted to identify the gaps within the network which may cause issues for people with low literacy levels. I did identify some gaps in both guidance and station design. This includes language used in the guidance being open to interpretation, giving designers and planners the ability to avoid different aspects which they may or may not have considered before, but because it was open to interpretation, making it quite hard to know what the right guidance is, and how the layout of a station can create difficulties if it's not very intuitive for people. So the focus group I held also helped me identify where areas were most difficult to use the network, and interpretations of the symbols used were also different to my expectations, which I hope I will illustrate to you later in the presentation. So I wanted to talk a bit about how my research evolved. I don't know if anybody's noticed, but the title of my research changed. So what was written on the invite to this presentation, to this session today, is actually different to what my final title became. So my original title was how the use of symbol systems and nudge theory instead of written language can increase equality in our transport system. And my final title was, does the written language create barriers? So I thought I'd include this slide as it shows how it changed over the course of me developing my research. When I applied for the bursary, I was mainly interested in how symbols and the design of the network, the kind of physical design of the network, may help people who find written language difficult to use navigate our systems. I was really interested in nudge theory being tactic to redirect a person's choice by altering the choice conditions. However, after numerous conversations with my mentor, Justin, I realized how wide that scope could be. So we discussed looking at things like the public realm, how people react in an emergency, the road signs and symbols. I could look at, assess different age groups and understand how difficulties for children on the network as opposed to adults or the elderly. And so I really needed to define it and give it some focus. And so as such, I decided to concentrate on large transport interchange, such as rail stations, and try to understand the barriers to adults with low literacy levels. I also found it really difficult to find any nudge theory literature related to transport. So I decided to try and incorporate how nudge theory could be used as a solution, which I'll go to later in the presentation. Oh, I just realized I haven't changed the date. That's how long ago it's been. Okay. Next slide. So why is this topic so important to me, or so important to everyone, I believe? So a surprisingly high proportion of adults have low literacy levels. In the UK, 14% of people have learning difficulties, with 7.1 million adults being described as having very poor literacy levels. So if written language in our network is too much, it can create that barrier to up to 7 million adults who are then limited to access. People could have low literacy levels due to a number of reasons, whether this is language barriers, learning disabilities, brain injuries, and that's just to name a few. The second one that I thought was really important was our transport network really does rely on travellers' understanding of written instruction. And this seems to be across all stages of a journey, from planning a journey to undertaking a journey, and then from in our public transport kind of our network, from leaving that public transport vehicle to finding your own destination. Written language is everywhere. So that must be really hard for people with those low literacy levels. The third one is the choice in the mode of travel can be influenced by clarity of instruction. As Rachel said earlier today, one bad experience can be off-putting. And if you don't have that clarity or an alternative to using the written language which is used in our network, it can create a really bad journey experience and therefore make people or prompt people, or it can really impact people's confidences, and therefore they end up going back to the easy option, which could in a lot of cases be the private car. So even just having that other alternative way of finding your way around rather than using written language can actually become a much more sustainable, kind of environmentally friendly way to influence people's travel. The economic prosperity, which is linked with transport access. So yeah, of course, like I said before, there's up to 7 million adults who may not have as much access as others because they don't have the higher levels of literacy. So transport access can be limited due to those low literacy levels, meaning that trips to work and higher education and play are inaccessible, and therefore people can fall into that cycle and can get passed on to future generations as well. When if you don't have that economic backing, then you can fall into that cycle. And then the fifth one was transport planning, as well as other partners that transport planners work with, such as architects or designers. We may not have taken into consideration the needs of those with hidden disabilities, and this can be due to not fully understanding the needs of those with those hidden disabilities, which of course needs to be corrected. So this is why I believe this topic is so important. Okay, so the gap identification. So in order to identify the gaps in our transport network, specifically rail stations, I conducted a desk-based literature review, and I explored Birmingham New Street as my case study. I also had a focus group with adults who were learning English as a foreign language, and I wanted to understand the relationship between the guidance and the Equalities Act against the actual station and the station user to understand where the difficulties lie and why those difficulties are there and what are the reasons behind it. So these are my key findings from my literacy review. And I realize how ironic this is, that this slide is full of text when I'm talking about literacy and low literacy levels and looking at alternatives. But I believe this is the only one in my slide deck, which is so wordy. So for the literature review, I looked at the Equalities Act in 2010. And this is where I found some gaps. So I believe there's a lot of ambiguity in the Equalities Act, and there's terms such as reasonable adjustment, which are kind of fluffy language and almost open to interpretation of what is reasonable. I put an example there that hypothetically it may be considered unreasonable due to monetary constraints to make adjustments based on a baseline information showing that not high level of site users have low literacy levels, whereas in reality they might not be using the station, so therefore that baseline doesn't identify that gap. So the Equalities Act states, though, that within both visible, such as physical, and invisible, such as mental health and learning difficulties, disabilities must not be discriminated against on public services, which includes transport. And public service buildings must make reasonable adjustments to the built environment to assist with disabilities, such as providing information in accessible format. However, it does not determine a definition of reasonable, leaving that open to interpretation. So the next one I looked at was the design standards. So for the design standards, I did look at the British Standards Institute 2018, which is the Design of an Accessible and Inclusive Built Environment Code of Practice. The Department for Transport's 2015 Design Standards for Accessible Railway Stations, and Network Rail 2015 Station Design Principles for Network Rail. So as these were standards and guidance, they didn't seem to hold any sort of accountability. And although the codes of, the practice and principles, there was no requirement to completely fulfill everything within them. So obviously it is best practice to do that. However, there was no accountability for people to do that. So not all elements may be addressed with the importance that they require, leaving the potential for those gaps to exist in the network. And then lastly, for nudge theory, like I said, it's quite difficult to try and find anything with regards to transport on nudge theory, but I did find some articles, one called Nudge by Taylor and Sustain. I think, apologies if I can't pronounce these very well. And then I also found Rethinking Nudge, Not One But Three Concepts, which was written in 2016. And I also found one with regards to wayfinding, so wayfinding in the Rijksmuseum. So I also found that using nudges can be quite controversial as it manipulates the choice in a decision. However, the majority of nudge theory literature is focused on law and economics and philosophy. So yeah, not much found on transport or wayfinding. However, it was found that there are suggested ways of mitigation for wayfinding by using nudge, and that was in that wayfinding in the Rijksmuseum. So moving on to my case study. So my computer's being a little bit slow. So here we go. So what I did for my case study, I had an interview with the New Street Station manager, which is Patrick Powers. He's no longer in that role anymore. I'm not sure where he's moved to or moved on to, but he did say that there is a huge gap when looking at literacy within the transport network, not necessarily just rail, but through all modes of transport, whether that is on the road network and road signs, whether it was, the bus, whether it's interchange points, everything like that. I paraphrased that, but yeah, that was one thing which really stood out to me when I was talking to Patrick about New Street Station. Okay, so if I don't know how many people know New Street Station, but this is kind of like the ground map floor, which you can find on National Rail Inquiries. But I thought I'd tell you a little bit about why I chose New Street Station, other than being the obvious big interchange that was closest to me during COVID that I could get to quite easily and safely. It is also a large transport interchange. The building is host to a shopping centre, so it's dual use, which has its own challenges. It has an unusually large amount of facilities for a train station because of this. And it has direct links with Birmingham International Airport, meaning that the station is potentially used by a large number of people whose first language might not necessarily be English. And and they may be traveling here for the first time and things like that. And it has also been recently redeveloped, probably about, I want to say in 2015, but I could be wrong. So that was why New Street Station. So as I mentioned before, the Department for Transport Design Standards say, as far as possible, stations should be laid out in a logical way so that finding a particular facility is partially intuitive. But as you can see here, I don't know if you can see my mouse on the screen, but the ticket desk is located here. In front of it, escalators, and the entrances, you cannot see the ticket office from any of the entrances directly. And that was the first thing that struck me when I read that sentence about making it intuitive. If you haven't been to Birmingham New Street station before, you go up there, you don't see the ticket office, you do have to look for it and find your way around. And some quotes from passenger feedback included that they do not find the station easy to navigate. They find it difficult to tell from the signs on each platform which exit to use to ensure that they get a connecting train without having to go through the ticket barriers. So the fact that people are coming up with these sorts of phrases, and these might be people, and I think this was just a paper survey, so the people with high literacy levels potentially as well, means that it's a great case study. For me, I could find a lot of things that could be worked on, let's say. And another challenge to Birmingham New Street is it's the only subsurface train station which isn't part of an underground network in the UK. And this comes again with its own challenges and design difficulties. So during my site audit, this slide I've put together just to kind of illustrate how much written language there is at a train station and for different uses. So again, the design standards said that ticket and vending machines, the information on screen should be easy to read, easy to understand and see. However, there are no visual prompts and it relies on the user being able to read or type information, which would be very difficult, as I'm sure you can appreciate, for people with low literacy levels. So even though there are clear announcements as well made, I kind of considered, is this enough? Is this enough for people to find their way around? Is it enough to compensate in all elements of the station use? To adhere to the guidance, again, this is mostly the station announcement with regards to arrivals, departures, delays and platform changes, rather than actually finding your way around as well. The information displayed on the signs should be straightforward descriptions. So again, it's back to the standards, and to be accompanied by recognized and adequately sized pictograms. The symbols should supplement the words, which, as they are more readily understood by people with either cognitive impairments or people whose first language is not English. But there is still this clear when is this clear when looking at the amount of information on the signs and what would happen if you took the words away? Is this still clear? What happens if you're in a rush, if you're running late to catch your train? Is this still clear to help people find the way around as and when they need to, under their different circumstances that they're arriving at the station? So my key findings from my interview with the station manager and going and doing an audit at Birmingham New Street is that New Street Station has a number of constraints, quite a few constraints. There is a subservice train platforms which introduced this weight capacity constraints, which meant that the station redevelopment really had to be careful what they were putting where on that surface level. So due to the subsurface nature of the train platforms, the costs of changes now that the station has been redeveloped are significantly higher due to strict fire regulations as well. So the increasing of costs of changing elements of wayfinding during the design stages can be difficult to mitigate and therefore potentially overlooked. The most common questions that were asked at the help desk were wayfinding related. So at the time of writing my bursary piece, the station was not intuitive and the ticket help desks and the main ticket machines frequently obstructed from view, as I attempted to show you on using that map, and they're not on the main, and they're on the main course. They're difficult to find if you don't know the station. But Birmingham New Street Station, they were actually going through a bit of a wayfinding change at the time of writing this. So I'll be interested to go back and see what they've implemented. And they were doing a bit of a redesign. of the wayfinding again within, and they were taking learnings from airports and the London Underground with the aim of having zones rather than lounges and being able to denote them using more colour. So this was some information which was sent to me by Patrick Powers. So the redesign of the station in 2015 meant that it adhered to different standards that are potentially what is in place today. So I think over time, in different stations and different areas, different, what we're talking about, different interactions between the different modes of transport. It really does have to be reviewed on a continuous basis to make sure it stays up to standard, and also as new learnings come through, take those into consideration and make sure they're implemented as and when things get reviewed and renewed. So New Street Station, I've just spoken about that one, is undergoing a new wayfinding strategy. There are also a number of successful and ongoing initiatives to ensure that continuous learning and that consultation with disability groups. So Birmingham New Street has an accessibility forum. They were the ones who first introduced the Sunflower Lanyard scheme, which is now more recognised as a hidden disability, almost through COVID, where people, they were wearing the lanyards to show that they were exempt from wearing face masks and things. There's also an assisted travel lounge. They've got changing places where people can go and get changed if they need to. And they're also partnership with Walsall College, working with young people with learning difficulties and trying to get them into employment. So there's been some great success stories about them doing internships and work experience with people who do have learning difficulties as well. So it is acknowledged as well that there are some potential gaps for those with low literacy levels. I say potential gaps. I felt that there were quite a lot of gaps for those with low literacy levels whilst using the station. Okay. So I'm not keeping an eye on time, which is a really bad, sorry. I'll try. And
you're all right, Anna. Don't worry.
Okay.
We're enjoying your presentation. Keep going.
Okay, thank you. So earlier last year in December, I say earlier, late last year in December, it was earlier when I was giving a presentation in January, but in December 2020, I held a focus group with students who were learning English as a foreign language. And this was through the Birmingham Adult Education Services. There were approximately 10 participants, all with different levels of English. However, there were none who were complete beginners. So I must acknowledge that the difficulties faced by different communities who find written language difficult are not all represented by this group. However, I'm hoping that it's likely that some similar issues are faced by different groups and communities which do have low literacy levels. So it's hoped that the key findings may help everybody to a certain extent. So my key findings from the focus group were that the most difficult stage of the journey when using rail was the station. Again, going through those things which I spoke about during the site audit and the interview with Patrick Powers. Wayfinding was most difficult at New Street Station. However, this was station specific. Buying a ticket at the station using the ticketing machines was difficult. So when the group was shown a picture of the home screen of the ticketing machine, they all initially assumed that they needed to touch the middle of the screen to start. Which is great. They knew there was touch screen. They understood that. However, the middle of the screen had an image of a button with text directing the user to use other buttons on the side of the screen. Therefore, touching the middle of the screen would not have allowed the users to proceed with the ticket purchase. So even small, it seems kind of a small thing for somebody like myself who has never had to face these barriers before with literacy, unless I've traveled to a different country. So the symbols used next to the writing were not necessarily clear enough. And there was an inconsistency in symbols used across the network, the rail network, which may cause confusion. So looking at these kind of findings together, I was thinking this could potentially be quite a quick and easy solution, especially with those inconsistencies with symbols across the network. So I'll explain a bit more about this in the next few slides. And then, although alternatives such as asking help from members of staff is available, this may also be a barrier to people with low literacy levels. So after conducting the focus group, I did have a separate session with their tutor. And she was telling me that they do activities like go to a station and teach people how to use rail stations, or, you know, go to a coffee shop, and they do those kind of practical and day-to-day experiences with people when they're learning English as a foreign language. And she said that the group knew that there was help available. However, in the situation where they found themselves in the train station, they felt almost embarrassed or afraid to ask for help. And this may be a case for other people with low literacy levels if they believe that there is a stigma attached to it. And there's also that element of personal pride that they want to be independent and they don't want to ask for help. So having these alternative ways or of helping people with low literacy levels use our network is so important. Okay, next, this is going into those symbols. So I don't know whether you can see, I think this black kind of ribbon is in the middle of the table there, but along the top there, the different columns say that it's a symbol, the actual meaning, and then what the focus group decided the meaning was when I showed it to them. So an exercise I did was I used those symbols found on the Birmingham New Street map from National Rail Inquiries and asked the learners to identify their meanings. So you can see the results here. Where the meaning was toilets, the focus group meaning, they thought that meant the exit. Where the symbol for cash point was, they assumed that was ticket machine. They thought that the changing places was actually a help desk. And then the ticketing machine caused a whole nother kind of conversation. They were completely unsure about what that symbol was because they'd already identified a different symbol as a ticketing machine. So you can kind of see there, you know, what the differences are and how these symbols can be made, or, you know, need to be looked at least, or considered in another way to be made more clear. So, you know, when you don't have the written language next to the symbol, they become a lot more confusing. Okay, and the next one was, these are the differences between the different symbols at different railway stations. And again, this was all taken from National Rail Inquiries. So this was the difference between the symbols at New Street Station and Nottingham. I'll just let you have a look at it. So the first thing I noticed was the help desk. Also, I had a little look at the map as well for the Nottingham station. So the first thing I noticed at Nottingham, so this is one which one of the focus group participants highlighted. She said, I love Nottingham station. It's great. I find it so easy to use, but New Street, no, don't like it. So I won't take the train to New Street. So the first thing I noticed when looking at Nottingham was that the help desk was in the line of sight from when you entered the building. And secondly, I noticed that the symbols were different again on here. So when you become used to using those symbols and then you leave that station and you assume that when you arrive at that station, the symbols will be the same and they're different, you're kind of stuck back down. You're back at square one, really. You're not sure where to go or where things are or what you need to do to make things easier for yourself, or just find your way around. I seem to have focused on wayfinding quite a lot through my study. So yeah, having those inconsistencies in the symbols used across the network can cause that confusion and therefore potentially a lack of trust. Again, which would, I guess, what's the word? Would make people reconsider using the train as a mode of transport for their journey. And yeah, again, as Rachel said, one bad experience is off-putting. So yeah. So moving on then, these are the gaps in the solutions which I found. So through this piece of work, I think I've already told you all about the gaps which I've identified. So they're mostly associated with how people with low literacy levels can use our network, and the focus group coupled with the desktop research, the site audit, and all that. I focused on 3 areas which I thought could be easy, quick wins, so much as my solutions and suggestions would of course need further research and further thought, a lot of the further thought. So these gaps included the guidance not holding the accountability, New Street Station not being intuitive, which can increase uncertainty and difficulties in using it, and the inconsistencies in symbols, and in some cases, lack of visual prompts to be used throughout the network. So this is my gap identification.
Anna, I'm so sorry to bother you when you're mid-flow, but we need to
Yeah,
wrap up
sure.
in the next couple of minutes.
I will wrap
all
up.
Right.
Yeah, I'm
Wonderful.
literally couple of slides. Sorry, I speak quite slowly. When I get into it, I get well into it. So the ticket machine prompts, people not understanding to push a button to initiate buying or collecting a ticket. This would be similar across Network Rail. Understanding the use of symbols, so the inconsistency of symbols, and then that illogical station layout. So the station users not being able to find the ticket or the help desk at New Street Station. I'll move on quickly. So they were the gaps, and here's the mitigation, which I thought could be used. So with the ticket machines, the development of a phone app to work in conjunction with a station, the use of QR codes potentially to give extra information as and when is needed, and adapting the existing help points around the station to include more visual aids or help. The understanding of symbols, we need consistent use of symbols across Network Rail, and the potential to change these symbols to make them more recognizable to everyday life, and emojis potentially by design, making that direct link between the written communication and the real world. So yeah, that's a kind of a thought to take forward. And the illogical station layout. So New Street Station has 3 entrances, and there could be potential to have 3 smaller help areas at the start of at each entrance or exit in sight of people as they enter or they leave the station. Potential nudges to assist in wayfinding, which is the next slide, and ensuring that the area in front of the ticket office is clear of any obstructions. So these were my examples, which I found of nudge theory, which I thought may be able to help. So the nudge examples were there on the left-hand side. You've got text, you've got symbols, but could that be coupled with that visual aid of, the different footprints on an escalator when you want people to stand on one side and walk down the other? And then kind of color denoted zones. So when you're telling people you need to go to the red zone, actually having those pathways lead in those colors to those zones. However, this does kind of come with other difficulties. If you do kind of implement these things, what does that then mean for people who have difficulty with like sensory difficulties? For example, people with autism, is it going to be an overload of sensory activity, which therefore may create a barrier to them? So again, needs to have a lot more thought. I'll leave it there for now. I've got just a thank you and a couple of final thoughts, but I'll leave that there for now. That's, I think. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Anna. I didn't mean to rush you.
No, not at all. I just looked at the time and I was like, oh gosh, I'm sorry.
Not at all. Really appreciate that. And thank you for presenting your research to us. Again, another really, really interesting piece of research, and has taken us in a completely different direction with the question. So I'm going to ask all the panelists, all the presenters, to turn their cameras back on. And I've got some questions to ask you, if that's okay. So we'll do this in kind of, it's a friendly round table type way. I'm going to pose the question and then direct it to you. And just to start off, because we haven't got loads of time for questions, I'm going to use the chair's prerogative and ask a question myself. I hope that's okay with everybody. And I'll try and work my way through the other questions that we've got as quickly as possible. So I just wanted to ask you, it's clear that you all really enjoyed doing the research that you did and looking into this topic. But if the transport industry, and that's us as professionals, could do one thing to make the transport system more accessible, what is it that you would focus on first? Yeah, I don't know who wants to kick off. Is there something you'd focus on first? Silence, so maybe, maybe it's more difficult.
I guess I'm muted. I was going to say, I think it's just more research and understanding. I feel like, it is a topic which has been missed, and especially sometimes when people think about disabilities or equalities, it kind of, I don't know whether it's just me, but you kind of automatically go to gender, age, disabilities, or like physical disabilities, or almost more than the hidden disabilities. And I think that's why a lot of areas can get missed. So I think, just learning and interacting with people who have disabilities is so important, or different needs, really.
Has anybody else got anything they want to add to that?
So from a slightly different perspective, I think I'd just focus on something quite easy. So if we're already doing things, if we've already got things in place but aren't quite doing them well enough, so turning on audio announcements on buses, if we know that makes a difference, then just start small, because it's not going to be that much effort to make that difference to people if it's already in place.
Yeah, I'd agree. Like, it's the small things I think would make a huge difference. Like Anna was saying, I thought with the nudge theories, just sort of helping people along the way, in a sort of small way, and then like increased announcements on public transport to make sure people really understand. Like, I definitely see the difference, from Glasgow and London. So London's always announcing to you like what's happening at this stop, where else can you go, and there's just totally none of that where I am. So it's just thinking about the full round approach, I suppose.
It's really difficult in terms of transport, isn't it? Because we talk about the actual journeys, so the kind of stuff that we do as part of the journeys, so trains, buses, trams, etc., etc. But there's also that infrastructure in stations, isn't there? And I don't think my mum will mind me telling you that she's got some issues with being able to walk very well now, and just making sure that toilets are accessible is such a big issue. And where they're supposed to be accessible, making sure that they are open, or somebody's got a key that can let you in, and all those kind of things. And it's just all those kind of things come together and make you think, actually, it's too complicated. I'm not going to do it anymore. We had a question quite early on in the evening from Eugene Clark, which was asking how confident we thought that politicians would eventually accept that proper transport systems can't be provided purely by the private sector. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that, on how we can work together in terms to provide a better and more accessible transport system. Maybe I'll pose it differently. Oh, I don't know. Have you got something to add, Lauren?
Yeah, sorry, I just dropped off the call. I think my internet dropped out. Sorry for that. But no, I think one thing that I think is really important when I actually listened to a different webinar on a similar topic was that within EQIAs that I was looking at for my research, often it's many different people from different departments that look into completing EQIAs for infrastructure. But a really interesting point was made that they don't actually often see the result of what has been found for that. So they've completed it, but not seen the end result. So I think a way to kind of coordinate that, and a way that we can really make sure that has been done, and that we find a way to monitor that afterwards, I think would be a really interesting way to look at it.
And I think linked to that, we had a question from Jamie Smith, which was, we're firstly saying how interesting the presentations were. So thank you, Jamie, but also asking if we as a group had looked at the UK policy and design guidance as part of the projects, and do we think policy and guidance is moving in the right direction in terms of creating a more accessible transport system? I don't know if anybody's got any thoughts about policies.
I know when I was talking to some of the policymakers for my research, they were definitely quite engaged, and you can see by the fact that they've responded to the pandemic that they are on the right roads, I think, to try and make things more accessible. But I don't know if anyone else has any experience as well.
Yeah, I think looking at the gear change and LTN 120 policies that were released, I think having increased imagery and phrasing around specifically in my topic of adaptive cycles, I think sometimes the awareness isn't there, and actually I think a lot of people take up cycling, for example, when they see someone else that would use a similar cycle themselves in policy. So I think just really opening up that conversation within gear change, hopefully will be a good step forward.
I think you've made a really good point there, Lauren. I think it's in my work, I feel it's a lot about role models, so realistic role models. So when you see somebody like you doing something, then you think, oh, that is for me. And I've spoken to all of you that are on the call as panelists tonight about the work that I've been doing in terms of making sure that transport planning is more representative, so that we get more people in the conversation and more people in the action that we're planning, and that we're hearing more voices, because otherwise we're only planning for such a small section of society. So I think it's important that we get more voices around the table, and we have more discussions like this where we look at what we can do. I was going to say, we've got another question or point from Matthew Roberts, who was asking, what are the panelists' top tips on how we can consider accessibility in our work as a standard? So do we think that we need, I don't know, societies like the Transport Planning Society to do something? Is it up to all of us? Is there something individual we should be doing? I'd be interested in your views.
I do feel like it's all of our responsibilities to consider how how to make our transport systems more equal, whether that's through development planning and, you know, planning for accessible neighborhoods. You know, it comes through every strand. And I guess forums like this, you know, really do help highlight and get people talking. I don't know, that's just off the top of my head.
No, I think you're right. I think if we're not talking about it or discussing it, then we're pretending it doesn't exist, or you know, we're not doing it, are we? I wondered if you had any thoughts about the difference in rural and city locations, because obviously we all work in transport, we're all transport professionals, but we know that situations can be very different, can't they, within the rural setting as in the urban setting, and whether we need to do different things within those settings. Anna's
I don't want to hog the microphone. I've just been talking for like half an hour and I wasn't supposed to be, so I don't want to hog it.
Not at all. I don't know, Ruth, Rachel, Lauren, have you got anything that you think about this rural urban mix? Oh, I think we've lost Lauren again. Oh, well. Maybe that's something that for us all to take away and have a think about in terms of that. And I wondered, we had a really good discussion at the Women in Transport networking last night. We're talking about changes in the situations now because of the pandemic, and how that's maybe made things a little bit less accessible for people, you know, so things that we might have been working towards, and it was by no means perfect. I'm not saying that before, there were a lot of issues, but if the pandemic has added to that kind of issue in terms of making sure that things are accessible. I know that I seem to not be able to hear properly with my face mask on. Yeah, it's just one of those things.
Yeah, that was something which, New Street Station, they were talking about, Patrick was saying how they're training some of their staff to use sign language to help people who do have hearing difficulties, so they'd be able to still wear their mask and be safe, but be able to sign. But then obviously, like a lot of people, you know, your facial expressions and everything gets taken into consideration when you're talking, and you know, people's interpretation of what you're saying is different if you're like, oh, kind of thing. So yeah,
I've realized I rely on that a lot, actually.
Yeah, I was going to say also, like, even perhaps just people were more wary about going up to people and asking for help, and or even the staff wary about coming up to you if they maybe think you look a bit lost, to help you out. So it was maybe perhaps restrict people doing new things or going new places, or just even trying to do their day-to-day stuff. So yeah. And
there's even that social aspect, isn't there, where people like in lockdown becoming very isolated, and then in the transport network, whether they feel comfortable to use the transport network, whereas like at one point maybe like getting the bus into town might have been part of their social thing that they did to interact with people.
I'm not in Nottingham today, but I live in Nottingham, where we all speak to all the bus drivers anyway. You know, we always thank them when we get off the train and things like that. But I think there's been less of that happening. People have had their face masks on as they've been getting on and off, and there's been less of that kind of nice interaction, which is what I quite like about traveling by public transport or traveling more sustainably. I like the interaction with people, and that's one of the things that really attracts me to it. And it's a shame, isn't it, that that's not happening quite as much. We are just coming to the end of the evening, and there's been so many amazing questions in the questions and answers. So I will ask, I promise everybody that's asked a question, I will ask the panelists to have a look at those and get back to you where you've asked a question specifically relating to their research. But I just wanted to kind of tie up the bursary thing and see whether you just touch on if you'd learned anything and anything you would say to anybody who was thinking of entering the bursary competition. It's actually closed for this year. So we're at the moment at the point where we are reviewing the entries, and we'll be appointing mentors probably next week. But in future, have you got any advice for anybody who was perhaps thinking about it? And perhaps I'll come to each in turn, so that I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about it. So Lauren, can I come to you first? I just wanted to know quickly how you'd found it and if you had any advice for anybody.
Yeah, definitely. I thought it was really, really great. I think it's a great opportunity to be able to speak on platforms like this. I wouldn't have had the opportunity to do before. And it was a really interesting topic. So it's really nice to get your teeth kind of stuck into something. And my tutor was really great. So offered loads of expertise and really helped that flow, and that's a connection now going forward. Still in contact with her, so yeah, really great.
That's great to hear. And I just want to say I have not bribed these people to say nice things. So if they don't say nice things, it's their choice. Ruth, how did you find it?
Yeah, definitely echo those thoughts. Really good opportunity, definitely go for it. And it really gives you, especially so early on in your career, it gives you such a good platform to sort of speak out on and learn, and also just make new connections with other people in the industry across the country, which I thought was really, one of the best benefits of it. Yeah.
Thank you. Anna.
I loved it. I loved it. I mean, I found it, I'm not gonna lie, I did find it a bit pressured. And I think that was probably because I started with quite a wide topic, and a lot of sessions with my mentor, Justin, absolutely fab guy, brilliant, really helped me like pin down what I wanted to do. So I think, I guess a bit of advice if you are doing the scheme is get that focus as soon as possible. I think I spent about 2-3 months decide which direction I wanted to go in, and then it was like, oh my gosh, December's only in a month's time, what am I going to do? Sort of thing. So yeah, that's where the pressure came in for me. But yeah, if you got that focus from the beginning, you'll be fine.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Anna. And I don't think Justin's on the call tonight, but I will give him that feedback. and Rachel, how did you find it?
Yeah, again, found it really great. It's a good way to push yourself out of your comfort zone and make good connections. I'd definitely echo what Anna said in terms of advice, that the deadlines come around quicker than you'd think, so it's good to crack on with it early before project work and everything else, no doubt, ramps up as well. But no, it's been really good experience.
Oh, that's good to hear. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. I'm afraid we have come to the end of the evening, but I do urge you to have a look at the TPS website, where you can read the research of all of our finalists in full, and also to join us for Transport Planning Day and the events leading up to it on the 15th of November this year. Thank you so much. Have a great evening and speak to you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.